Most mornings in the village began quietly, with the crow of roosters, the rattle of carts, and the smell of dust warmed by a rising sun. People went about their chores, carrying baskets, herding animals, speaking in the same tired phrases that carried yesterday into today. Everyone expected another plain day, but destiny often hides behind what looks ordinary. And that morning it chose a dump yard, where the air stank of rot and forgotten scraps, to write a story no one had seen coming. There, among broken pots, sharp tins, and torn baskets, lay an elderly woman. She was sprawled on the waste, her body twisting faintly as though pain itself were trying to spill out of her bones. Her once white hair was now tangled with clods of dirt, and her eyes fluttered half shut, leaking sorrow even before tears could form. Her shawl, filthy and frayed, clung loosely to her frame like a cobweb on dry branches. She looked abandoned, as people often say, like a curse that had finally fallen where it belonged. Neighbors walked past quickly, clutching their bundles tighter, whispering cruel lines between their teeth, pretending not to see. Some muttered, "This is punishment. You reap what you sow." Others shook their heads and hurried on as though the very sight would infect them with misfortune. To them, she was nothing but a bad omen lying where all trash was meant to end. But then came the rumble of wooden wheels against stones, the creak of a tired donkey pulling its load. Farmer Kudzani's cart appeared, piled high with sacks of heavy grain from his harvest. His back glistened with sweat, his chest rising steady under the rhythm of labor. He should have kept going, as everyone else did. That's what the villagers expected. Yet the sight glued his feet to the ground. He pulled the cart to a stop, his eyes scanning the figure writhing faintly in the dump. While others passed with cold silence and disdain, Kudzani left his harvest in the sun, walked over, and bent to the ground. He did not just help her stumble back to her feet. He did not say cold words that would excuse him from responsibility. No. He placed her in his cart, exactly in the space meant for the fruits of his hard labor. He made her rest where the golden corn usually lay. That single action, quiet, simple, tender, was the beginning of a story none of the gossiping villagers would ever forgive or forget. Because what no one around him knew was that this woman carried a bitter secret. Once, she had been welcomed at her own home, surrounded by sons and daughters. But those children, seeing her as too heavy a burden, too wrinkled and slow to serve, had flung her out, discarded her like so many broken tools. Years later, after hearing she now lived not in shame but with dignity at Kudzani's small farm, those same children would creep back. They wouldn't come to kneel and beg forgiveness. They would come with hearts sharpened by greed, carrying a plan so cruel that the village itself would be forced to face a final judgment. But on that first night, Kudzani wasn't thinking of the future. He was thinking of the present moment, his cart groaning under sacks of maize, his conscience urging him to carry something more precious. His decision was quick. Without weighing losses, without measuring what the neighbors might say, he simply shifted the heavy sacks of corn to one side, creating a narrow hollow, an improvised bed. He lowered her down gently as though she were treasure, fragile, priceless, easy to break. The old woman, Nierai, trembled in shame. She pulled weakly at her shawl, whispering that her dirt and stench would stain him, that perhaps he would one day regret touching what the dump had already claimed. He held her arm a little tighter, eyes soft but voice firm. "If I have the strength to lift a hoe every day, I also have the strength to lift you. If this land has given me grain to eat, how could I deny care to someone who hungers?" Her light body weighed less than the sacks he carried daily, but his heart knew the truth. It was not weight, it was responsibility. With every step away from the dump, each glance from villagers was like a spear thrown at his back. Some smirked openly, mocking. "The farmer's lost his head," they muttered. "Whoever brings trash home will rot with it." Not one word left his lips in reply. He placed a sack under her head, let the donkey lean into its harness, and guided them away in silence, bearing her as if she were part of the harvest itself. The road to the farm was harder than usual. Stones jutted out, holes jolted the cart, and each bump shook her frail body. Kudzani walked beside the cart, guiding the donkey gently so the jolts would cause less pain. A cold wind dragged itself over the hills, carrying with it clouds and the sharp sting of night air. Above, 1,000 stars lit the path dimly. Kudzani pulled off his blanket, thin but still warm, and without hesitation laid it over the woman. He kept only his shirt, shaking slightly under the night air. "The cold won't defeat me," he muttered softly. "But it could defeat you." Tears slipped down her weathered cheeks, soaking the rag he had earlier used to clean her face. She could not form sentences, not yet. But her wet eyes spoke louder than words. On the way, a group of young men returning from the market spotted them and burst into laughter. voices like knives twisting. Look, the farmer's donkey now carries human garbage. Good in the cart driver for trash. But Kudzani stopped, his feet anchoring to the ground. He looked each of them straight in the eye and replied with steady calm, "One day you'll learn. The trash you despise can feed more than the bread you eat." Silence fell like a hammer. The boys, their own pride suddenly shaken, turned away, unable to look him in the eyes again. By the time the cart reached his farm, the dogs were at the gate, barking joyfully and wagging their tails with trust. That small house of clay walls and straw roof glowed faintly under a tiny oil lamp. He climbed down, cradled her frail body in his arms once more even as she tried to beg him not to. "Don't carry me inside," she whispered. "I'll bring curses to your home. The villagers' tongues will burn your doorstep with shame." Yet he shook his head, steady and unafraid. Those who fear the villager's tongue never plant, so they also never harvest. Tonight, what matters is saving you, not pleasing voices outside. Through the threshold he stepped, carrying her like someone holds a seed too rare to lose. His hut, simple as it was, stopped being merely a workplace. That night it became something larger, a haven, a refuge, a rebuke to the world's indifference. On a mat, he laid her gently, covered her with soft cloth, and brought water from the well. Each move was more than pity. It was conviction, a choice that declared loudly, her dignity was worth protecting. Outside, whispers grew. Neighbors peered through the gate, curious but afraid to enter. They sneered, shaking their heads. If her own children cast her away, what good does she bring? Bad luck has only found a new bed. No one dared step closer. They wanted only to watch, waiting for the curse to fall. Inside, meanwhile, compassion lived. Kudzani lit the stove, placed a pot with water and beans, crushed maize with hardened hands. As the grains boiled, he remembered the jeers he had endured along the way. Trash dirties the one who carries it. Yet a voice stronger than mockery rose inside him. Those who deny bread to the hungry soil their own soul. By the time food was ready, Nirai had tried to sit up, a shadow of her strength peeking through. "You don't need to do all this," she whispered, voice trembling like dry leaves. "I got used to living with nothing." Kudzani knelt, held her frail hands in his and answered, "As long as I have bread, no one here will eat from the ground." At that, her shoulders shook quietly, tears spilling, not of pain, but a stunned sense of being seen again. He set a basin of warm water beside her, telling her to wash slowly, promising tomorrow he'd help with the rest. She dipped her hands, feeling warmth, feeling something cleanse deeper than skin. The sorrow of rejection washing away, grain by grain. Later, he placed before her a simple bowl of steaming stew and a saved piece of bread. She stared at it as though beholding a miracle. "No one has offered me food, only contempt," she managed to whisper. He sat silently nearby, letting her claim each spoonful at her own pace, while outside the wind rattled the mango leaves and the villagers hissed from the gate. Inside, however, another seed had been planted, a seed of respect, one that grows even in the poorest soil. When at last she lay back, resting against a cloth pillow, her voice rose once again, fragile yet searching. "Why do this for me when we are strangers?" Kudzani's eyes found the firewood glowing on the stove. "Because my mother once said, it is not blood that makes us family, but the gesture." Her eyes closed at last, not from despair, but peace. For the first time in years, she slept not as a burden, but as a human being worth sheltering. That night brought no luxury, no mattress, no fine blankets, no shining windows. There was only a mat on clay floor, the smell of burning branches, and a man who chose to believe compassion outshines contempt. Yet in that silence, something changed. An old woman, once scorned and condemned as a curse, slept with the quiet of someone finally restored to the world, and by morning, before the first rays stretched across the fields, whispers had already slipped like smoke across the market, by the well, on the dusty corners where women peeled cassava. No matter where people gathered, there was only one theme of conversation. One topic dominated the conversations. Kudzani's foolishness. "They say he brought the old woman from the dump into his house," murmured one. "I saw it with my own eyes," replied another. And the news, like fire in dry grass, spread fast, igniting stares and judgments. Some said Kudzani had lost his mind. Others claimed that the woman must be a witch disguised as a poor old lady sent to drain the farm's good fortune. "There's no way someone is abandoned by their own children for no reason," argued one of the village's elders, shaking his head in disapproval. The children, meanwhile, listened in secret and repeated what they heard at home, adding weight to the growing suspicions. With every mouth that spoke, old Nur became less human, and more of a burden in the eyes of the community. Inside the farm, she herself began to feel the weight of those sharp tongues. When she went out to gather firewood, she felt the sidelong glances, mothers pulling their children away, as if mere proximity to her could bring misfortune. At the market, no one wanted to sell her flour. "Everything you touch rots," someone once told her. I returned home with an empty basket, ashamed. The words hurt more than the hunger. And on a clear moonlit night, sitting on the doorstep, she let a thought escape in a soft voice. "I should leave before people do harm to you, Cootie. It's enough that I carry my shame. I don't want your house to become a reason for disgrace too." The farmer, who was sharpening his hoe nearby, paused and looked at her with unwavering resolve. The firelight reflected in his eyes, giving him an air of unshakable conviction. "Those who fear words never plant nor harvest," he said, pausing between each word as if driving stakes into the ground. "Let them talk. Those who laugh at us today will come asking for our advice tomorrow." Those words echoed in Nir's mind, but the insecurity didn't vanish so lying on the mat. She remembered the children who had cast her out, the neighbors who watched her carry heavy pots alone without offering help, the eyes that had always reduced her to a burden. All those memories returned like shadows in the middle of the night. The difference now was that in this house there was a man willing to face them with her, while the village spread poison with words. Kudzani remained firm in his routine. In the fields he sang old proverbs while plowing the earth. In the kitchen he shared warm bread with Neri, unfazed by the whispers floating in through the gate. Each of his gestures was like a silent wall standing against the cruelty of the village. As the days passed, the contrast between the ville's rumors and the reality inside that home became increasingly clear. While their voices insisted she was a curse, Nay was helping prepare maize, sweeping the yard, exchanging old stories by the stove. And with each task, her shame gave way to a thread of recovered dignity. But the village didn't give up. One elder during the weekly assembly raised the matter before everyone. If he insists on sheltering that old woman, let him face the consequences. But don't come crying when the harvest fails and the rain doesn't fall. There were murmurs of agreement, and many nodded. Kudzai and I was present, and he let them speak in silence. At the end he stood and said, "Only if the sky chooses to punish me for taking in a mother, then I'd rather live punished than live in peace with a dirty conscience." The room fell silent. No one dared reply. The villagers' sharp tongues had met the resistance of a man unafraid to stand alone. And Nir, upon hearing those words, felt a relief she hadn't known in years. That night, for the first time, she allowed herself to smile. It was a small smile, weary but true. Despite the weight of all the words chasing her, inside that farm there was a shelter no tongue could tear down. The nights on the farm remained quiet, interrupted only by the distant song of crickets and the crackle of firewood burning in the stove. It was in this calm atmosphere, lit by the orange glow of the embers, that Neri slowly began to open the door to her past. Kudza, Useto listening more than speaking, would sit by the fire after a long day in the fields, resting his callous hands on his knees, while the old woman stared into the flames as if facing memories too heavy to name. One night, her voice broke the silence. "You don't know why I was at that dump. Maybe you think I've always been that woman lying among torn-up sacks. But no, I once had a home, a family, children." Her voice trembled at that last word. Goods and I looked up attentive, but said nothing. He knew some truths can't be pulled like maize from the ground. They need to sprout in their own time. "My children grew up on my back," I went on. "I carried each of them in my arms, nursed them until it hurt, sold vegetables at the market so they could have notebooks and shoes. I gave up parts of myself so they could be whole. But one day, when my arms could no longer lift heavy sacks, they told me I was useless. They said I was just another mouth to feed." She paused, took a deep breath, and gripped the edge of her skirt tightly as if still feeling the sting of those words. Kudzani slowly clenched his fists. The firelight flickered in his eyes, revealing a silent anger. "A child who casts out their mother forgets who brought them into the world," he said. His deep voice like thunder held back. "Land that rejects the seed never yields a good harvest." His words filled the air like a solemn vow. Nir didn't smile. She simply let a tear fall, disappearing into the clay floor, lost in the shadows. "They didn't just send me away," she continued. "They turned their backs on me like I was a curse. When I tried to stay, they said if I came back again, they'd call the neighbors to force me out. I left with nothing in my hands, only the dress on my body. Since then, I wandered from place to place, eating scraps, until my body gave out and collapsed in that dump where you found me." The silence that followed was heavy. Kudz and I took a deep breath, holding back the rage rising in him. "Your children forgot that the cord that tied them to life came from your womb," he said. "But God hasn't forgotten, and those who threw you away will one day taste the bitter fruit of abandonment." She looked at him, surprised by the strength in his words. For a long time she had believed she deserved the rejection she'd suffered, that maybe Shirley was just a burden. But there, in front of the fire, a simple man with no blood ties was giving her back the right to be a mother and a woman. Night after night, she shared more fragments of her story. She spoke of how she used to sing her children to sleep, of sleepless nights caring for fevers, of the quiet sacrifices made so that they'd never lack anything. Each memory came with the pain of having been traded for convenience, for ambition, for a cruel idea of usefulness. Cuds and I listened in silence until one evening, unable to hold back, he said, "They cast you out because all they saw in your frail body was what it couldn't give anymore. But I see in your heart what you never stopped giving, love." Those words broke something inside her. Near I wept like a killed, sobbing by the fire. Kudzani simply reached out his hand, letting her hold it. There was no more distance between the farmer and the old woman the village had scorned. In that simple gesture, a bond was born, a pact of respect and dignity that no abandonment could erase. And so, in that humble home, the old woman's secret stopped being just a hidden wound. It became a seed planted in good soil, ready to prove that even the deepest pain can bloom when it finds the ground of compassion. Time began to flow differently on the farm. The days were no longer just made of plowing, hoeing, and harvesting. There was now a new presence that shifted the rhythm of both mornings and nights. Near, once seen as a useless burden, started waking up earlier than everyone, despite her tired body and aching knees. She would head to the kitchen where the scent of wood smoke and flour still lingered in there, and with fragile but memory-filled hands began preparing something carried deep in her memory. Recipes she had learned from her mother and grandmother kept like invisible treasures. One day, when I returned from the fields exhausted, he found a type of bread on the wooden table that he had never seen before. Its golden crust, the strong smell of herbs mixed with maize. It all reminded him of childhood, of when his own mother was still alive. He approached slowly, as if afraid to break a spell. Near Ishai murmured, "I have no way to repay what you did for me, but I know how to give flavor to what the land provides." The farmer broke the bread with his hands, and the sound of the crust cracking filled the room with a respectful silence. As he tasted the first bite, his eyes closed for a moment, and he gave a faint smile. "The land gives grain," he said, "but you give memory. This taste isn't just food, it's a root." The news didn't take long to spread. Children from the neighborhood, drawn by the smell drifting from the chimney, began to appear little by little. At first, they peeked through the gate, curious. Then, gaining courage, they clapped their hands shyly, asking for a piece of that different bread made by the very hands that not long ago had been scorned. Denai, apron tied around her waist, smiled at each of them and served generously, offering more than food. She offered affection. She offered warmth. The children's parents, seeing their joy, began to approach as well. Some who had once spoken ill of her now greeted Kudzani with a mix of shame and curiosity. That fresh bread turned the farmer's home into a meeting place. Theon's lonely table was now surrounded by voices, laughter, and shared stories. Nyri, who no longer had anyone to teach, began to show the young girls how to knead the dough, how to feel the right point with their hands, how to use herb leaves to perfume the flour. Each lesson came with old sayings. Bread without patience doesn't rise, or dough made in a hurry feeds the body but not the heart. The girls laughed, but they tucked those words away like seeds of wisdom. Kudzai watched everything in silence. For him, this was the true reward. Not in coins, not in riches, but in life blooming in his backyard. He saw the old woman once hidden among the trash become a guardian of memory, a keeper of knowledge the village had long forgotten. And in his heart, he silently thanked God for not listening to the venomous tongues of the community. One night, after everyone had gone, Kudz and I sat by the fire and said, "You owe me nothing. But today, I've understood something. When we open the door for someone, we often receive in return a whole world we didn't even know existed." I looked at him, eyes misty, and replied, "I didn't bring riches. I didn't bring land. I only brought what was left of me. But if that's enough to warm this house, then I haven't died in vain." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. The embers burned slowly, lighting the faces of the two, no longer host and guest, but companions on a journey. And that night Nir slept with a lighter heart, knowing that her first offering hadn't been a burden, it had been a gift. That's how the once rejected old woman stopped being seen as a weight, and began to be remembered as a root. No longer the woman who had fallen in the dump, but the guardian of knowledge who fed not just stomachs, but entire souls. Time passed, and with it the whispers in the village began to change in tone. Where once Neri had been called a curse, many now saw her as a kind of quiet matriarch, someone who had brought life back to Kudzani's farm. The children still ran to the gate, drawn by the smell of fresh bread, and even some of the elders who had once spit on the ground at the mention of her name had begun to accept her as part of the farm's daily rhythm. But news, as always, traveled beyond the limits of the village, and it reached the ears of those least deserving to hear it. Naira's children, they had lived their lives far from their mother. Never once looking back, they moved on without remorse, convinced that the old woman had disappeared into the dust of the road. But when they heard she was alive and being well cared for on Kutsani's farm, the memory they had cast aside began to bother them again. Not out of love, but from the same self-interest that had always driven them. One morning, while Kudzanai was working in the fields, two men appeared at the entrance to the farm. They were Tana and Rufuro, Naira's oldest sons. The clothes they wore betrayed their success in faraway ventures, expensive fabrics, new sandals, and a smug air of superiority etched on their faces. They walked through the gate without asking, like men who believed they had a right to everything in sight. When Nyari saw them, her heart faltered. The body that had stood tall with new dignity now trembled as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She whispered, barely audible, You remembered me?" Rufaro, with a cold smile, replied, "We came to make things right, mother. We came to ask for your forgiveness." But Kudzanai, approaching the house and hearing part of the exchange, instantly sensed the dissonance between their words and their eyes. They weren't looking at their mother with remorse. They were looking at the farm, the stored maize, the animals in the pen. The forgiveness they offered wasn't a plea. It was bait. Doana tried to mask it. "I heard this man has been generous to you. But a mother belongs with her sons, not with strangers. If you forgive us, you can come live with us. And maybe we can even share some of this land. After all, if he treats you like family, he surely wouldn't deny your real sons what is rightfully theirs." Polite words, but poisoned daggers. Kudzanai stepped forward, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and said firmly, "You didn't come for your mother. You came for what you think you can take." The brothers glanced at each other, caught off guard. But Rufaro quickly fired back. "Don't speak like that, farmer. We are her blood. You are just a stranger." Nero, hearing this, felt torn. Her mother's heart, though wounded, still held fragments of affection. But as she remembered the day they cast her out, the cruel words that called her useless, the old pain surged again. She lowered her head, tears running down the grooves of her face, and whispered, "You only remembered me when you heard of bread and land. Where were you when I needed water and sheltered the village? Always alert to whatever stirred. Soon heard about the visit?" Gossip spread through the streets. Now that she's being treated like a human being, her sons come back hungry for wealth. Some laughed with contempt, others were outraged, but all waited to see how Kudzani would respond. He did not flinch. With a strong voice, he said before everyone, "I don't recognize as sons those who cast out their mother. Whoever throws away the root does not deserve the fruit of the tree. This land, this roof, they're not for opportunists. Here we welcome only those who bring truth in their hearts." His words echoed and silence fell over the crowd. Doana and Rufaro tried to argue, but the strength in Kudzani's voice and the shame in their mother's eyes silenced them. They left the farm with heads held high, but their heavy steps betrayed their defeat. The village which once mocked Nai now looked at those two men with scorn. The visit from her ungrateful sons passed over the farm like a shadow, but also like a light that revealed the contrast. Nero, once abandoned, now had someone willing to defend her with his own honor, and the community began to realize she was not the one who should bear shame, but those who had once rejected her. The days following Tana and Rufaro's visit hung heavy over the farm, like storm clouds about to break. The entire village buzzed with talk, and each mouth told a different version. Some said Thisons had returned, truly repentant, and that Kudzani had been too harsh. Others insisted their greed for the farmers' goods was obvious, that they were nothing more than opportunists, ashamed by their mother's success. But one thing was certain. Nairai's wound was now exposed for all to see. The uproar was so great that the village elders decided to call a public meeting in the central square. It was tradition in the village to resolve major conflicts before the community, so all could hear and judge in the light of truth. People began gathering even before sunset, bringing wooden stools, woven mats, even pots of porridge to eat while they waited. There was an air of anticipation, as if everyone was about to witness a decisive chapter in their collective story. At the center of the circle, Kudzana arrived with Neri. The old woman walked slowly but with her head held high even as her heart pounded. Shortly after came Ta and Rufaro, trying to maintain the posture of beautiful sons. Their clean clothes stood in stark contrast to the accusing stares surrounding them. The eldest of the village elders, Muk, took the floor with the authority of someone who had judged many disputes over the years. "Today we're not here to decide on land or riches. Today we decide on honor. and a mother's honor cannot be bought or sold. The crowd fell silent. Mukundi gave the floor to Nero. Her hands trembled, but she took a deep breath and spoke before them all. Her voice was weak but full of truth. I gave my blood so they could live. I worked the fields, sold vegetables, stayed awake at night to make sure they lacked nothing. But when I grew old and lost my strength, they called me useless and threw me out. I wandered aimlessly, eating scraps until I collapsed in a dump, where this man here lifted me up. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many remembered having seen her, frail and alone, but had chosen to look away. Kudzai then stood up and added, his voice unwavering. These sons didn't come for their mother. They came for what they think they can inherit. But inheritance is not for those who despise the root. Whoever spits on the womb that gave them life does not deserve to taste the fruit of dignity. Tawana, angered, interrupted. That's a lie. We came seeking forgiveness. A mother belongs with her sons, not with a stranger. But before he could continue, a woman from the crowd, once a neighbor of Neri, stood up and said loudly, You asked for forgiveness only when you recognized the pain. You never looked for her. Not until you heard about the farm's abundance. Where were you when we saw her begging for food? Where were you when the cold nearly killed her? The assembly began to stir. Some stomped their feet. Others shook their heads in disapproval. Elder Mukundi raised his hand for silence and concluded, This village has always honored the mother as the root of life. Those who abandon their mother deserve no seat at council and no respect. Today, before all, I declare that Nier is once again recognized as part of this community. But you, Tana and Rufaro, you shall carry the weight of shame. May your own shadows follow you. No gavel, no written sentence. The judgment came in the form of cold stars, angry whispers, and the quiet distance people kept from the ungrateful sons as they left the assembly. For the first time they tasted what their mother had known, the weight of being rejected by your own dot. As for Neri, though marked by the pain of having her story exposed, she walked back to the farm with a different kind of step. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been seen in years, the feeling that finally the truth had come to light. Kudzana walked beside her in silence, but the grip of his hand on her arm spoke louder than 1,000 words. From that day on, the entire village knew who the true burden had been and who the true root was all along. After the judgment in the village square, Nei's days were never the same. The weight of shame, which for years had bent her like a dry, brittle branch, began to fall away little by little. The woman who once walked with her head down, avoiding the village's stares, now stood tall with dignity, like a tree that rediscovers the strength of its roots after a long drought. The first time she returned to the market, silence swept the place. Everyone remembered the day she had been shunned, even by her closest neighbors. But now, as she passed by the stalls, the gazes that met her were no longer filled with contempt, but with cautious respect. Her vendor, who once refused to sell her flour, offered her a handful of maize, as if to ask forgiveness without words. Nier accepted with a slight nod. No speeches were needed. Life had spoken for her. As she walked, the children ran toward her. Grandma Nier, when will you bake bread again? They asked, smiling as if they'd always treated her with affection. She smiled back, gently touching each child's head with wrinkled but steady hands, and replied, Bread takes time to rise. My children, you need patience. The children's laughter echoed down the street, and little by little, even the adults began to approach her, greeting her with newfound respect. On the farm, her presence was no longer seen as a burden, but as a foundation. Kudzana, who had always stood firm in defending her, now watched with quiet satisfaction as transformation unfolded before his eyes. Who would have thought, he mused from the porch, that the same woman who once lay in the dump now walks like a queen through the market? But the change wasn't just outward. Inside, she was rediscovering strengths she thought were long dead. Laughter returned to her lips. During conversations around the stove, old songs she once sang to her children began to echo again, this time to cheer the village kids who came toned dough and listened to her stories. Each melody was like an invisible thread, stitching back the pieces of her lost dignity. Even so, the memory of her ungrateful sons still visited her in the dead of night. Often she'd wake in silence, heart heavy, thinking of their faces. But now, instead of drowning in sorrow, she knelt before the dimming firelight and murmured simple prayers, not asking God for riches, but for peace. If they cannot love me, may they at least learn not to reject the mother who gave them life. These words, spoken softly, were seeds of forgiveness sown on the wind. The village, which once spat on the ground at the sight of her, now invited her to sit in circles of conversation. The elders who had once used her story as an example of disgrace, now cited her as a symbol of resilience. Life is like the field, said Mukundi, the oldest of the council. Before the people, those who care for the land harvest fruit. Those who reject the root harvest shame. Naya's living proof. These words made the old woman feel like she was once again part of the community that had cast her out. But more than that, they made her realize her story no longer belonged only to her. She had become a mirror for other women in the village, many of them also forgotten in their own homes, also treated like burdens as they aged. When they saw her walk with her head high, they rediscovered hope that it was still possible to reclaim dignity. Even after so much abandonment, I watched everything in silence. He never sought recognition. But inside him, he felt the reward of having listened to his conscience when everyone else turned their backs. He no longer saw nearby as the fragile woman who had fallen among the trash, but as someone blooming again, like a tree that survives the drought and returns to give shade and fruit. And so the transformation wasn't only night. It was the villages, a people who had learned through hardship, the difference between seeing someone as a burden and recognizing them as a root. The woman they had once ignored was now respected. The dump where they had left her became a seat of honor, and the eyes that once rejected her now lowered in reverence as she passed by. Time moved forward, and with it came harvest season, the most anticipated time for every farmer in the village. It was when months of sweat and toil turned into golden corn, baskets full of beans, ripe pumpkins, and well-fed chickens. On Kudzani's farm, the work was intense. Men and women took turns in the fields. Children ran laughing between the corn rows, and the sun bathed every effort like a blessing. But that year, something different hung in the air. It wasn't just the abundance of the harvest that left an impression. It was what the harvest meant. The farm was no longer seen as the property of a solitary man, but as the place where a rejected elder had been reborn, and where through her the community had begun to heal. Goods and I saw it in every neighbor's eyes as they came to help. In every gesture of respect I received as she walked among the corn baskets. It was she who suggested that at the end of the harvest a communal feast be held. A table only has meaning when it's shared, she said firmly, kneading bread dough with hands that no longer trembled from weakness, but worked with renewed energy. Kudzana agreed, knowing this wasn't just about feeding people. It was about planting something deeper, the memory that dignity multiplies when it is shared. Preparations began early. Na led the kitchen like a true matriarch. She organized the younger women to peel cassava, season meats, wash fresh kale and coriander. The smell of spices and firewood drifted through the air, announcing that the night to come would be unlike any other. Children helped by carrying water, darting about with contagious excitement. By the time Thason dipped behind the hills, the table was set beneath the mango trees. It was a long table improvised from planks and mats, yet so full of meaning that it seemed greater than any royal banquet. There were bowls of boiled maize, steaming stews, fresh fruit, and at the center the breads prepared by near golden and fragrant, reminding everyone that even from abandonment, abundance can rise. One by one the neighbors began to arrive. Some came hesitantly, still carrying the memory of how they had once treated the old woman. Others arrived smiling, bringing small offerings of food to add to the table. But in every gaze there was one shared truth. They were witnessing a moment that would mark their history. NY, dressed in a simple clean cloth, took a bowl of stew in her hands and served the first neighbor who approached. She didn't wait to be served. She stood and served each guest with her own hands. She looked into each person's eyes as she gave them their portion, offering not just food, but a symbolic act of honor and reconciliation. From a dump, a full table was born, murmured one woman, her voice emotional as she received her plate. Others nodded, unable to hide their own emotion. The feast slowly became a celebration, not just of harvest, but of life and of restored dignity. Children ran round the table. Men talked about the bounty of the fields. Women exchanged recipes, and in quiet reflection or aloud acknowledged that this elder woman once forgotten had become the guardian of unity. Kudzana, I watched in silence, a quiet smile on his face. For him, seeing near serve each neighbor was more precious than any plentiful harvest. It was as if her gesture washed away the shame the village had once carried, cleansing the marks of indifference that had nearly cost her life. As the night deepened and the moon lit the yard, Neri raised one of the empty baskets and said, "Today we proved that nothing is too small to be shared. Life threw me away, but God gave me back in the form of a table, and from now on, no one here will have to eat alone." The village fell silent. Some discreetly wiped away tears because what was shared that night wasn't just food. It was also the weight of a story of a woman who, rejected by blood, had found family through choice. And so that year's harvest would not be remembered only for the bounty of the fields, but for the abundance of dignity. The old woman once left in the dump was now the hand that served, the heart that embraced, and the root that held an entire community upright. The harvest feast had left deep marks in the village's memory, but more than in the community, it left marks in the hearts of Kudzanaya and nearby that night. When the neighbors had said their goodbyes and the children stopped running around the yard, only the silence of midnight and the dying embers of the clay stove remained. It was in that silence that the two looked at each other with a bond that no longer needed words. They were no longer host and guest, farmer and elder woman, but something different, something more intimate, woven not by blood, but by shared pain and care. As the days passed, that unexpected bond became increasingly visible to everyone. Kudzani, once seen as a solitary man, was now called by some the old woman's son. And instead of being offended, he wore the title with pride. He began treating her as a mother in front of everyone, calling her my Neary mother. Near I every time he spoke to her, and with every time he said it, the old woman's heart trembled, as if she had finally been restored to the place from which she had been cast out. Near in turn began caring for him, as if he were a son of her own heart, not just in meals or advice, but in the little things that only genuine love knows how to give. She saved him the best piece of meat, made herbal teas to ease his fatigue, and on the coldest nights kept the fire burning late, so he'd return home to warmth. Many times she sat on the doorstep waiting for him like a mother waiting for her child. Their bond grew so strong it crossed the boundaries of the house. When they went to the market together, they walked side by side, and Kudzani wouldn't let anyone look down on her. If anyone dared to mutter criticism, he would respond firmly, "This woman is my mother, and whoever disrespects her disrespects me too." Those words silenced even the boldest, for the village knew there was no greater offense than dishonoring the bond between mother and son. In time, even the most skeptical began to accept the relationship. The children, who already called her grandma, now copied Kudzana's example and treated her with reverence. Younger women came to seek her advice on raising children or preparing traditional recipes, and Theman recognized in her a wisdom no wealth could buy. The woman who once lay forgotten in a dump had become a mother to all. But above all, she was mother by heart to the man who had the courage to choose her. And still there were nights when Near cried in silence, despite all the love she had received. The memory of her ungrateful son still pierced her like a thorn that could not be removed. Cuds and I noticed one evening he said to her, "Don't worry about those who rejected you. Blood can betray, but choice does not. And I chose you as my mother." Those words were like balm to her soul. For the first time in a long while, she truly believed it was still possible to be loved without conditions. The village, once a witness to her pain, now bore witness to her victory. People would say you don't need to be born from the same womb to be family. They proved that the unexpected bond between Nero and Kudzani became a living example that life can rewrite stories, even when everything seems lost. One late afternoon, as dry mango leaves fell across the yard, Kuds and I called to her and said, "Mother, this land is no longer just mine. It's ours. You're not a guest. You're the root of this farm." Near I, tears in her eyes, replied simply, "And you, my son, are the harvest God gave me after the longest drought of my life." And so, in that unexpected bond, the village learned a quiet but unforgettable lesson. Family isn't just who shares your blood, but who stays when everyone else walks away. Time flowed on like a river that crosses the seasons without ever stopping, and as the days passed, fate sealed each part of this story. Neary's ungrateful sons, Tawana and Rufa, vanished once again, carrying with them the shame they had worn since the villagers' judgment. They were remembered only in whispers. "As a warning, those are the ones who abandoned their mother," said the elders, when teaching the young the value of gratitude. Their names became more of a caution than a memory, more of a collective wound than a family legacy. But Near, the woman everyone had once seen fallen in the trash, found the unexpected, not only shelter, but respect. She became an indispensable presence in the life of the village. When children wanted to hear stories, they ran to her house. When women needed guidance, they sought her calm, steady words. Even the men listened because her voice carried the authority of someone who had known hunger, rejection, and pain, but had never let her heart dry up. On the farm, she was no longer a guest. The yard where she once walked in shame had become ground where her steady steps echoed like those of a matriarch. Her gaze, once dimmed, now shone with the fire of someone who had won battles no one believed she could fight. The lines in her face no longer told only of sorrow, but also of a silent victory born from perseverance. And Kudzani, the farmer who once found her among the garbage, was no longer the same either. He had once been a solitary man known only for his hard work and simple life. Now he was remembered as the one who defied the village and chose compassion over indifference. His name was spoken with respect, and many said his farm prospered not only because of his hands, but because justice lived in his heart. The bond between them had grown so deep that no one dared question it anymore. Kudzani called her mother in public and in private, and Near I treated him as a son of the heart. The blood that wasn't shared had been replaced by something stronger choice, and the whole village understood. Family is not only made of blood, but of those who choose to stay when everyone else walks away at the final harvest feast of that cycle. Near I stood before everyone and spoke with a clear voice, one that surprised even the most doubtful. Many saw me lying in the trash and thought my story had ended. But no, God lifted me through the hands of a just man. And today I stand here serving at a table I once believed I'd never see again. Learn this, my children. Those who treat people like trash end up forgotten. But those who welcome forgotten lives, they saw respect that lasts for generations. The village fell silent. Some wept. Her words were not a sermon. They were lived truth rooted in experience that the entire village had witnessed. It was the most powerful kind of lesson, not written in books nor preached from pulpits, but spoken through the life of a woman who had once been cast out and was now recognized as the root of her community. And so the story closed with a sense of moral justice. The ungrateful sons faded into obscurity, branded by shame. The rejected elder was lifted from the trash to become a symbol of dignity. The solitary farmer found in an act of compassion more than companionship. He found a legacy of love, a root that would carry his name beyond his time. And the village once marked by indifference learned a simple and eternal truth. No one who rescues forgotten lives walks away empty-handed. On the contrary, those who plant love are the ones who harvest respect. And since then, when someone walks past the farm of Kudzani and Nye, they whisper as if repeating an old proverb. That woman wasn't just rescued from the dump. She rescued the whole village from indifference. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our